I never thought a random encounter at a work event would uncover a secret that would tear my entire family apart. My name is Alex, and I always thought I knew my father inside and out. Growing up, he was the rock in our family, the steady presence that kept us all grounded. He was the guy everyone respected, someone who would give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. My mom, Lisa, adored him. To her, he was the love of her life, and for 30 years, their marriage seemed rock solid. My sister Julie and I grew up in what I always believed was the perfect household. Sure, there were ups and downs like in any family, but we were tight-knit. Everything changed one night, without warning. It was late September, and I had to attend a work conference. These kinds of events weren't unusual, but this one was out of town, far enough that I had to stay at a hotel for a few days. I wasn't particularly looking forward to it, but I figured it was just a part of the job. The conference was filled with the usual boring presentations, and by the time the second day rolled around, I was already tired. So, after the last session of the day, I decided to hit the hotel bar and unwind a little. I wasn't expecting much. I figured I'd just grab a drink and maybe chat with some colleagues if I ran into anyone I knew. But as I sat there nursing a beer, something caught my eye. Across the room, sitting at a small table, was my dad. At first, I thought it couldn't possibly be him. Why would he be here? He hadn't mentioned anything about traveling, and it was rare for him to be out of town for work. But the longer I looked, the clearer it became that it was, indeed, him. He was sitting with a woman I had never seen before, and they were laughing, leaning close to each other in a way that made me uncomfortable. I kept watching, my heart pounding in my chest. The way they interacted wasn't casual. There was an intimacy between them, something more than just friendly conversation. And then, it happened, he leaned in and kissed her. Not a quick peck on the cheek, but a real kiss, the kind you don't give someone unless you're romantically involved. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. My dad, the man who had been married to my mom for 30 years, was cheating on her. It didn't make any sense. This wasn't the man I knew. My head started spinning as I tried to make sense of it all. Was this a one-time thing? Or had he been seeing this woman for a while? I thought about going over there, confronting him right then and there, but I couldn't move. It was like I was frozen in place, watching as my father and this woman left the bar together, hand in hand. I sat there, staring at the empty space where they had been, trying to process what I had just seen. For the next few days, I felt like I was living in a fog. I couldn't focus on the conference, couldn't think straight. All I could see was the image of my dad with that woman, and I kept replaying it over and over in my mind. I wanted to confront him, but how? How do you bring something like this up? And what about my mom? How could I tell her? When I finally got back home, I still hadn't figured out what to do. My dad was acting like nothing had happened. He asked about the conference, told me about some minor issues they'd been having with the house, and went about his usual routine. I watched him carefully, looking for any signs of guilt or stress, but he seemed completely normal. But I wasn't normal. I couldn't look at him without feeling a wave of anger and betrayal. Every time I saw him and my mom together, my stomach turned. How could he be so deceitful, pretending like everything was fine when he was clearly hiding something so huge? And how could I, knowing what I knew, sit there and say nothing? For weeks, I struggled with what to do. I knew that if I told my mom, it would destroy her. She loved him with all her heart, and I couldn't bear the thought of breaking her like that. At the same time, I felt like I was betraying her by keeping this secret. The guilt was eating me alive. I stopped going over to their house as much, finding excuses to stay away. I couldn't handle the tension inside me, the constant battle between telling the truth and keeping the peace. Julie noticed that something was off. She asked me if everything was okay, but I brushed her off, telling her I was just stressed from work. I didn't want to drag her into it, but she was persistent. She kept calling, trying to get me to come over for family dinners or hang out on the weekends, but I couldn't do it. Being around my dad felt suffocating, like I was drowning in the secret I was keeping. Eventually, though, it all came to a head. It was a Sunday evening, and my parents had invited Julie and me over for dinner. I had avoided these get-togethers for weeks, but Julie wouldn't take no for an answer this time. She had this idea that we all needed to spend more time together, and I couldn't come up with a good enough excuse to get out of it. So there we were, sitting around the dinner table, making small talk. Everything seemed normal, but underneath it all, I felt like I was sitting on a ticking time bomb. At one point, Julie started talking about her new boyfriend, how she hoped their relationship would last, and she made a comment about how she wanted a marriage like our parents one day. That was it. That was the breaking point. Without thinking, I muttered, "If only you knew." The room went silent. Julie looked at me, confused. "What are you talking about?" I glanced at my dad. His face had gone pale. My mom was staring at me, waiting for an explanation. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest, but I couldn't stop now. "I saw Dad," I said, my voice shaking. "A few weeks ago. At a hotel. With another woman." The shock on my mom's face was immediate. Julie looked at me like I had just told her the earth was flat. My dad, on the other hand, stayed completely still, his face a mask of blankness. "What is he talking about, Mark?" my mom asked, her voice trembling. My dad didn't answer. He just sat there, staring at the table. I told them everything. How I had seen him with the woman, how they had kissed, how I had been wrestling with whether or not to tell them. My mom was crying by the time I finished, and Julie was in shock. She kept asking my dad if it was true, if he had really been cheating on Mom. Finally, he spoke. He admitted it. He had been seeing this woman for over a year. He said he never meant to hurt anyone, but that he had fallen out of love with my mom a long time ago. He tried to explain it away, saying that their marriage had become more like a friendship than a partnership, but none of it mattered. The damage was done. That night, everything fell apart. My mom was devastated, Julie was furious, and I felt like I was watching my family disintegrate before my eyes. The worst part was knowing that, in a way, I had been the one to set it all in motion. If I had just kept quiet, if I hadn't said anything, maybe things would have stayed the same. Maybe my mom would have lived in blissful ignorance. But now, there was no going back. In the weeks that followed, my parents separated. My dad moved out, and my mom was left to pick up the pieces of her life. She went through a dark period, where she didn't want to see anyone or do anything. Julie and I took turns checking on her, making sure she was eating, trying to get her to go outside. Eventually, she started seeing a therapist, and slowly but surely, she began to heal. Julie took it especially hard. She had always been close to Dad, and the betrayal hit her like a ton of bricks. For weeks, she refused to speak to him. When she finally did, it was just to yell at him, to tell him how much he had hurt her and destroyed the family. I tried to be there for her, but I was struggling with my own emotions. I didn't know how to feel anymore. Part of me wanted to forgive him, but another part of me couldn't get past the betrayal. My dad moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, and every time I visited, it felt like walking into a different world. His new place was stark and impersonal, a stark contrast to the warm, lived-in home he had shared with Mom. I struggled with our interactions. He would ask about my life, my job, but the conversations always felt superficial. We talked less and less, and our once close relationship began to feel like a distant memory. One particularly tough day, I decided to visit him unannounced. I wanted to see how he was holding up, maybe find some closure for myself. When I arrived, he looked surprised but welcomed me in. We sat in his small, sparsely furnished living room. There were boxes still unpacked, a single picture of our family on the wall, a picture that felt like it belonged to a different life. "Why did you do it, Dad?" I finally asked after a long, uncomfortable silence. "Why did you throw everything away?" He sighed heavily, rubbing his hands over his face. "It wasn't like I planned for any of this to happen," he said quietly. "I don't expect you to understand. I wasn't happy with your mom for a long time, and I guess I was weak. I found comfort somewhere else. But you didn't even try to fix things with Mom," I said, my voice rising in frustration. "You just gave up." "I didn't give up, Alex," he snapped. "We both knew our marriage wasn't what it used to be. Your mom and I, we were just going through the motions. But I know that's no excuse for what I did. I'm sorry I hurt all of you." I wanted to believe him, but the anger inside me wouldn't let go. I stood up to leave, my heart heavy with unresolved feelings. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive you for this," I said, my voice trembling. "But I hope you find a way to make peace with what you've done." Weeks turned into months, and the effects of the betrayal continued to ripple through our lives. My mom, despite her initial devastation, began to rebuild. She threw herself into new hobbies and gradually started to reconnect with friends she hadn't seen in years. Her recovery was a slow process, but she showed incredible resilience. Julie and I helped her through it, and while our relationships with her deepened, the wound left by Dad's actions remained a constant reminder of the past. Julie eventually began dating again, though she struggled with trust issues. She worked on her own healing process, attending therapy sessions and talking openly about her feelings. Her growth was inspiring, and while she still had moments of pain, she learned to navigate them with a newfound strength. As for my dad, his life seemed to fall into a routine of solitude and regret. He spent much of his time working on his apartment, attempting to create a space that felt like his own. He occasionally reached out to me, but our interactions were strained. There were moments when I could see glimpses of the father I once knew, but they were fleeting. The trust between us had been irrevocably altered, and our conversations often fell back into uncomfortable silence. One day, I received a call from my dad asking if we could meet. He wanted to talk about something important. I agreed, though I wasn't sure what to expect. We met at a small cafe, a neutral ground where we could talk without the emotional baggage of our homes. I wanted to apologize, he said, looking down at his coffee. Not just for what I did to your mom, but for the way it affected all of you. I know I can't undo the past, but I want to make amends in whatever way I can. I appreciate that, I replied cautiously. But apologies don't change what happened. It's something we all have to deal with in our own way. He nodded, understanding. I know. I just needed to say it out loud. I'm working on myself, trying to understand where I went wrong and how I can do better. The conversation was emotionally charged but also cathartic. For the first time in a long time, we had an honest discussion about the impact of his actions. It didn't fix everything, but it was a step towards healing. In the end, our family was forever changed. My mom became a symbol of strength and resilience, Julie grew into her own self-assured person, and I learned the difficult lessons of forgiveness and the complexity of human relationships. While we couldn't turn back time, we moved forward with the knowledge that even in the wake of profound betrayal, there was room for growth and understanding. I often think back to that night at the hotel bar, the moment that shattered the illusion of our perfect family. It was a painful revelation, but it also opened the door to deeper connections and new beginnings. Life had taken us down an unexpected path, but as a family, we learned to navigate it with newfound clarity and compassion. The day I found out my brother was living a double life, everything I thought I knew about family loyalty was turned upside down. My name is Michael, and I always thought I had a close bond with my older brother, Ethan. Growing up, Ethan was the quintessential big brother, protective, kind, and someone I looked up to. He was the type of person who always had a plan and knew how to make everything work. He was a successful businessman, married to a lovely woman named Sarah, and they had a beautiful daughter, Lily, who was just a few years younger than my own kids. Their family seemed perfect, and I envied their seemingly flawless life. One weekend, my family and I decided to visit Ethan and Sarah at their country house. We hadn't been there in a while, and it felt like a perfect opportunity to reconnect. As soon as we arrived, the warm welcome from Ethan and Sarah made us feel at home. We spent the day catching up, laughing, and enjoying each other's company. It was the kind of day that reinforced how close our families were. But as the evening wore on, I noticed something strange. Ethan was acting a little off, distracted, constantly checking his phone, and occasionally stepping outside to take calls. I shrugged it off, thinking he was just dealing with some work issues, but it didn't sit right with me. Later that night, after the kids were tucked into bed and Sarah had retired for the evening, I decided to take a walk around their property. I wanted some fresh air and a moment to myself. As I strolled down the path near the edge of their land, I noticed a dim light coming from a small shed that I had never seen before. It seemed unusual since Ethan was usually meticulous about keeping everything in order, and this shed had never been there during our previous visits. Curiosity got the better of me, so I approached the shed. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see a sliver of light inside. I pushed it open gently, peeking inside to see what was going on. What I saw next made my heart skip a beat. Inside the shed was a small office space, cluttered with documents, a laptop, and stacks of envelopes. The walls were lined with framed photos, none of them were of Ethan, Sarah, or Lily. Instead, they were pictures of a different woman and her children, along with photos of Ethan with the same woman. The setup was a jarring contrast to the life I knew he led. I felt a wave of disbelief and confusion wash over me. Was Ethan having an affair? Was this his secret life? I wanted to investigate further, but I knew I had to be careful. I snapped a few photos with my phone, feeling like I was intruding on something deeply personal. The next morning, I tried to act normal. I kept my suspicions to myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As the day progressed, I noticed Ethan was even more distracted. He made several more phone calls and left the house a few times, claiming it was for urgent work matters. By the time we left, I was on edge. I wrestled with the decision to confront him. I knew I had to be careful, accusations without proof could destroy our relationship. But I also knew I couldn't ignore what I had seen. Over the next few days, I conducted my own investigation. I dug through the photos I had taken, and the more I looked, the clearer it became that Ethan was leading a double life. I found online profiles, emails, and other evidence that pointed to a woman named Jessica, who seemed to be the person in the photos with him. I started to piece together a timeline. Ethan and Jessica seemed to have met about 2 years ago, shortly after Ethan had started to become more distant with Sarah. They had been meeting regularly, and their relationship appeared to have escalated from an affair to something more serious. The documents in the shed included plans for trips, gift receipts, and even a lease agreement for an apartment that Ethan had rented under a different name. Each discovery felt like a punch to the gut. The more I uncovered, the harder it was to digest. I felt like I was walking through a minefield of emotions, betrayal, anger, and sadness all swirling inside me. I knew that whatever I did next would have far-reaching consequences, but I couldn't stand by and do nothing. Finally, I decided to confront Ethan. I arranged a meeting at a neutral location, a coffee shop where we could talk privately. My heart pounded as I prepared to lay everything out. When we sat down, I tried to keep my voice steady. "Ethan, I need to talk to you about something important," I began. "I've seen some things that have me worried. I need to know if there's something you want to tell me." His face went pale. He looked like a deer caught in headlights. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to play it cool. I pulled out my phone and showed him the photos I had taken. His eyes widened as he looked at the evidence. For a moment, there was silence as he absorbed the shock of being caught. I didn't want you to find out this way," he finally said, his voice trembling. "There's a lot I need to explain." Ethan admitted that he had been living a double life for the past 2 years. Jessica was someone he had met through work, and their relationship had started as a friendship before turning into something more. He had tried to keep it separate from his life with Sarah and Lily, but it had become too complicated to manage. "I didn't want to hurt Sarah," Ethan said, tears in his eyes. "But I was unhappy in our marriage. I felt trapped, and I sought comfort elsewhere. I never meant for any of this to come out." I was at a loss for words. Part of me wanted to understand, to see if there was a way to salvage the situation, but another part of me was deeply angry. How could he do this to his family? How could he betray everyone who loved and trusted him? "Ethan," I said finally, my voice cold. "You need to come clean to Sarah. She deserves to know the truth. It's not fair to keep her in the dark." He nodded, clearly defeated. "I know. I'll tell her. I just hope she can find it in her heart to forgive me." The fallout from our conversation was immediate and intense. Ethan confessed everything to Sarah. The confrontation was explosive, and it shattered the image of the perfect family they had built. Sarah was devastated. She struggled to comprehend the betrayal, and their relationship, once strong, was now on the brink of collapse. Sarah took the news hard. She was a pillar of strength for the family, but the revelation knocked her off her feet. She spent days in tears, grappling with the realization that her husband had been living a lie. She felt humiliated and lost, and it was difficult for her to come to terms with the reality of her situation. She had always prided herself on being able to handle anything life threw her way, but this was different. This was a direct assault on everything she had believed in. In the days that followed, Sarah began to isolate herself. She stopped answering phone calls and emails, and she withdrew from her friends and family. Her focus was entirely on trying to make sense of the betrayal and to figure out what was next. The emotional toll it took on her was evident, and it became clear that she needed time and space to heal. Ethan, meanwhile, moved out of the family home. He took a small apartment in the city, which was a far cry from the comfortable suburban life he had left behind. He tried to reach out to Sarah, but she was not ready to see him. The few times they did speak, it was strained and full of unresolved anger. Ethan tried to explain his actions, but every explanation felt hollow in the face of the pain he had caused. As the weeks turned into months, the impact of the betrayal rippled through our entire family. Julie, my sister, was deeply affected. She had always admired Ethan and saw him as a role model. The revelation of his double life shattered her idealized image of him. She felt a mix of anger and sadness, struggling to reconcile the brother she had known with the man who had committed such a grave betrayal. Julie began to distance herself from Ethan, focusing instead on supporting Sarah and Lily. She spent a lot of time with them, helping them navigate the emotional fallout and trying to provide a sense of stability during a turbulent time. She also sought therapy to help her process her feelings and to understand how to move forward. Lily, Ethan and Sarah's young daughter, was caught in the crossfire. She struggled to understand why her father wasn't around anymore and why her family life had changed so dramatically. She missed her father deeply, but the emotional distance between them grew wider with each passing day. Sarah tried to shield her from the worst of the fallout, but Lily could sense the tension and sadness in the household. As for me, I continued to support Sarah and Julie, but I found it challenging to navigate my own feelings. I felt a deep sense of responsibility for the fallout, knowing that my decision to confront Ethan had set off a chain reaction that led to the unraveling of their family. Despite my anger and hurt, I remained committed to helping Sarah and Lily through this difficult time. The process of healing was slow. Sarah began to rebuild her life piece by piece. She threw herself into her work, reconnecting with friends she had lost touch with and discovering new interests. She found solace in creative pursuits and gradually started to regain her confidence. It was a long and difficult road, but she showed remarkable resilience. Lily adjusted to the new normal with the support of her extended family. She began to see a counselor to help her deal with the emotions and confusion she was experiencing. With time and patience, she started to find her own sense of stability and happiness. Ethan's journey was more complicated. He continued to live in his small apartment, trying to make sense of his actions and seeking therapy to understand why he had acted the way he did. He wanted to make amends, but the damage had been done. His attempts to reconcile with Sarah were met with varying degrees of resistance, and he struggled to find his place in a world that had changed drastically. Eventually, Ethan and Sarah reached a point where they could communicate more civilly. They began to work out a co-parenting arrangement for Lily and started to address the practical matters that needed resolution. Though their relationship was forever altered, they both committed to providing the best possible environment for their daughter. As time went on, our family dynamics adjusted to the new reality. We learned to navigate the complexities of relationships and the aftermath of betrayal. The pain of the past never fully went away, but we found ways to move forward. We developed a deeper understanding of each other and ourselves, and we worked to rebuild trust and connection in whatever ways we could. Reflecting on that day when I discovered Ethan's secret life, I realize it was a turning point for all of us. It was a painful revelation, but it also opened the door to growth and new beginnings. We had to confront the truth and face the consequences, but in doing so, we learned valuable lessons about forgiveness, resilience, and the importance of honesty. Our family, once shattered by betrayal, gradually found a way to heal and grow stronger. It wasn't an easy journey, but it was one that taught us about the complexities of human relationships and the power of moving forward despite the scars of the past.